The baby won't stop crying, ma'am, and if this continues, we may have to take further action." The words hit Sophie Miller like a punch she couldn't afford to feel. Not here. Not now. Not at 30,000 feet with every pair of eyes already judging her as she tightened her grip around her 6-month-old son, her arms aching from hours of trying, failing, trying again to calm him down, his tiny face red and trembling as his cries filled the narrow cabin like an alarm she couldn't shut off, and she could feel it. The tension spreading row by row, the sighs, the annoyed glances, the quiet whispers that weren't quiet enough. People in press shirts and noise-canceling headphones shifting uncomfortably as if her existence itself was an inconvenience. And Sophie lowered her eyes, her cheeks burning because she had seen this look before, too many times. The look that said you don't belong here, not in this space, not among people who had things under control, not among people who didn't have to count every dollar before booking a last-minute flight with money they didn't really have. And she swallowed hard, whispering soft apologies to her baby, to the strangers, to a world that never seemed to make space for someone like her. And just as the flight attendant opened her mouth again, more firm this time, more final, a calm voice beside Sophie cut through the tension like it didn't belong to the same moment. "It's okay. I've got this." And Sophie turned, startled, because she hadn't even noticed the man sitting next to her until now. Tall, composed, dressed simply but with a quiet confidence that didn't need attention. And before she could protest, before she could explain or apologize again, he gently reached out, his movements careful, respectful, asking without words, and something about the steadiness in his eyes made her hesitate just long enough for him to take the baby into his arms. And somehow, impossibly, within seconds, the crying softened, then faded, replaced by small hiccuped breaths as the baby settled against him as if he had known him forever, and the entire row seemed to exhale at once, the tension dissolving into a stunned silence that made Sophie blink in disbelief, her body still tense, as if waiting for something to go wrong. Because things always did, but nothing did, not this time, and the man didn't say anything more, didn't look around for approval or recognition. He just gently rocked the baby, his focus entirely on this small, fragile life that wasn't his responsibility. And Sophie felt something shift inside her, something she didn't have time to understand because exhaustion hit her all at once, heavy and undeniable, the kind that creeps up slowly until it takes everything. And before she realized it, her head had tilted, her body giving in, and she fell asleep. Right there, against his shoulder, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the only thing anchoring her in a moment that felt unreal. And for the first time in days, maybe weeks, she wasn't bracing herself for the next problem, the next judgment, the next door closing in her face. She was just still, and when the plane began its descent and the subtle change in pressure stirred her awake, Sophie blinked, disoriented, her mind catching up slowly until she realized where she was, who she was leaning on, and she pulled back quickly, her heart racing, ready to apologize again. But the moment she lifted her head, she noticed something that made her freeze. The people around her weren't looking at her the same way anymore. Their expressions had changed, not annoyed, not judgmental, but curious, almost cautious. And then she heard it, a voice from the aisle, respectful, almost urgent. "Mr. Hayes, we've prepared everything for your arrival." And Sophie's breath caught as she turned back toward the man beside her, suddenly aware that she had no idea who he really was. And the calm stranger who had just held her baby looked at her with the same quiet composure and said softly, "Get some rest. You're going to need it." As if he knew something she didn't, as if this flight was only the beginning of something she wasn't ready for. The name echoed in Sophie's mind like something she should recognize but could not quite place. Mr. Hayes. The way the flight attendant said it with that careful respect, the way her posture changed instantly, straighter, more attentive, as if the man sitting beside Sophie was suddenly someone entirely different from the quiet stranger who had just calmed a crying baby in seconds. And Sophie felt her chest tighten as she glanced at him again. Really looked this time, noticing the details she had missed before, the subtle precision in the way his shirt fit, the watch on his wrist that did not scream for attention but quietly suggested it could pay for everything she owned twice over, the calmness in his expression that did not come from comfort but from control, and her fingers instinctively pulled her baby closer as if she needed something familiar to hold on to while everything else shifted around her. "I am so sorry," she said quickly, her voice barely steady as she adjusted herself upright, creating space between them as if she had crossed a line she did not understand. "I did not mean to fall asleep on you." But he only gave a small shake of his head, almost dismissive, not of her, but of the idea that it mattered. "You needed it," he said simply, his tone even, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world, and somehow that made it harder for her to respond because people did not usually speak to her like that, without judgment, without expectation, without making her feel like she owed them something in return. And before she could find the right words, the plane touched down, the soft jolt sending a ripple through the cabin as people began reaching for their belongings. But the energy around her felt different, quieter in a way that made her more aware of every movement, every glance. And then she noticed it again, the subtle shift as two men in dark suits appeared near the front, not rushing, not drawing attention, but clearly waiting there, eyes scanning the cabin until they landed on him. And Sophie's stomach dropped because there was no more pretending now, no more guessing. This man was not just someone kind. He was someone important, someone whose presence changed the atmosphere of an entire plane without him even trying. And she suddenly became painfully aware of her own situation, the worn edges of her bag, the way her clothes had creased from hours of travel, the quiet fear that she did not belong anywhere near whatever world he came from. And she lowered her gaze again, focusing on her baby, as if that could anchor her back to something real, something she understood. But then his voice came again, softer this time, closer. "Where are you staying tonight?" And the question caught her off guard, because it felt too personal, too direct, and for a moment she considered brushing it off, giving a vague answer. But something about the way he asked made it feel like he already knew she did not have a real plan, like he could see through the fragile confidence she had been holding together all day. "I will figure something out," she said finally, forcing a small smile that did not quite reach her eyes. And he studied her for a brief second, not intrusive, not judging, just observing, and then he nodded once as if confirming something to himself. "No, you will not," he replied calmly. And before she could react, before she could ask what he meant, one of the men in suits stepped closer, leaning slightly to speak to him in a low voice. And Sophie caught only a few words. "Car is ready. Hotel prepared." And her heart began to race again because none of this felt like coincidence anymore. None of this felt like a simple act of kindness from a stranger on a flight. And as the aisle began to clear and people stood to leave, he turned back to her, his expression unchanged but his words carrying a weight she could not ignore. "I made a few arrangements for you and your son," he said, as if it was nothing, as if people did that every day. And Sophie stared at him, confusion and disbelief crashing together because she had not asked for help. She had learned not to expect it, and yet here it was, something too big, too sudden, and she could feel it, the moment stretching between them, the realization that whatever was happening right now was about to change more than just the end of her flight. "I did not ask for anything," Sophie said quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop them, not ungrateful but guarded, because every instinct she had built from years of barely getting by told her that nothing this big ever came without a cost. And she shifted her baby higher against her shoulder, holding him closer as if he was the only certainty in a moment that was quickly slipping beyond her understanding. And Alexander Hayes did not react the way she expected. There was no offense, no impatience, just a slight tilt of his head as if he respected the hesitation more than blind acceptance. "I know," he replied, his voice steady, almost reassuring. And that made it worse somehow, because he was not trying to convince her. He was simply stating a fact. And Sophie felt her chest tighten again as the line of passengers slowly moved forward, people stepping into the aisle, reaching for overhead bags. The normal rhythm of landing continuing around them while her world felt like it had paused in a completely different direction. "Then why?" she asked, her voice softer now, not defensive but genuinely confused, because she could not find a reason that made sense, not one that fit the life she knew. And for a brief second, something shifted in his expression, something almost reflective, as if her question had taken him somewhere else, somewhere deeper than the moment they were in. "Because someone once helped me when I had nothing," he said, And the simplicity of the answer caught her off guard because it did not sound like a story he told often. It sounded like something he carried quietly. And before she could ask anything more, before she could even process what that meant, one of the suited men stepped forward again, this time more gently. "Sir, we should move." And Alexander nodded slightly before standing, his movements smooth, unhurried, and suddenly the small space they had shared for hours felt different, like it had only existed for a limited time and was now closing. And Sophie watched as he reached for a small bag. Nothing excessive, nothing that matched the presence he carried. And then he turned back to her, not as a stranger anymore, but not quite something familiar either. "There is a car waiting outside," he said. "It will take you to a hotel. Everything is arranged. You and your son will be comfortable tonight." And Sophie opened her mouth to protest again, to say she could not accept something like that she would figure it out like she always did. But the words did not come out because a part of her, a very real part she had been ignoring for too long, knew she did not have a plan, knew that after this flight she had nowhere certain to go, and the weight of that truth pressed against her as strongly as her pride pushed back. "I cannot repay you," she said finally, her voice almost a whisper, and he gave the smallest hint of a smile, not amused, not dismissive, just understanding. "I am not asking you to," he answered. And for a moment, everything stilled again, the noise of the cabin fading into the background as Sophie stood there between two choices, the one she had always taken, struggling alone, and the one that felt unfamiliar, uncertain, but undeniably real, accepting help from someone she did not know, someone whose world was nothing like hers, and yet who had stepped into her moment without hesitation. And as the line moved forward and the exit grew closer, she realized something else. This was not just about a ride or a hotel room. This was something larger, something she could not yet see, but could feel forming just beneath the surface. And when she finally nodded, just slightly, barely noticeable, Alexander did not react with triumph or relief. He simply acknowledged it with a calm look that said he had expected nothing less. And as they stepped off the plane into the bright terminal lights, Sophie held her baby a little tighter, her heart racing not from fear this time, but from the strange, unfamiliar sense that for the first time in a long while, her life was about to change in a way she could not control. The moment Sophie stepped into the terminal, everything felt brighter, louder, and somehow unreal, like she had crossed into a space that did not belong to her. The polished floors reflecting overhead lights, the steady flow of well-dressed travelers moving with purpose while she stood there for a second too long, holding her baby and trying to process what had just happened. And before she could gather herself, one of the suited men approached her with a polite but firm tone. "Miss Miller, this way please." And the fact that he knew her name made her hesitate, her grip tightening slightly around her child as her instincts told her to be careful. But then she glanced ahead and saw Alexander walking a few steps in front, calm and unbothered, as if this was just another ordinary moment in his day. And something about that steadiness gave her just enough reassurance to follow, her steps slower, more cautious, as she moved through the crowd, aware of how out of place she must look next to them. And yet no one stopped her, no one questioned it, as if being near him was enough to open doors she had never even seen before. And when they reached the exit, the warm air outside hit her gently, carrying the distant hum of the city, and then she saw it. A long black car waiting by the curb, sleek and spotless, the kind she had only ever seen passing by from a distance, and the driver stepped out immediately, opening the door with quiet efficiency, and Sophie froze for a second because this was no longer something small, no longer just a kind gesture. This was real, tangible, and far beyond anything she had experienced. "You can go ahead," Alexander said, his voice calm as ever, gesturing toward the car, and Sophie looked at him, searching for something, a sign that this was too much, that she should refuse, that this was a mistake. But there was nothing in his expression that suggested doubt, only a quiet certainty that made it harder to argue. And slowly, almost carefully, she stepped forward and got into the car, adjusting her baby in her arms as she sat down, the soft leather seat beneath her unfamiliar but undeniably comfortable, and the door closed gently behind her, sealing her into a space that felt both safe and overwhelming at the same time. And a second later, Alexander entered from the other side, sitting across from her with the same composed presence, and for a moment, neither of them spoke as the car pulled away from the curb, merging smoothly into the flow of traffic, and Sophie looked out the window, watching the city lights blur past, trying to ground herself in something familiar. But everything felt different now, every second carrying a quiet weight of something changing, something she could not yet define, and after a few moments, she finally turned back to him, her voice steady but filled with questions she did not know how to ask. "What kind of arrangements?" she said, choosing her words carefully, and he met her gaze without hesitation. "A place for you to stay, for as long as you need," he answered, simple and direct, and Sophie felt her breath catch slightly because that was not a temporary solution. That was something else entirely, something she had not expected. "And after that?" she asked, almost afraid of the answer. And for the first time since she met him, there was a slight pause before he responded, not uncertainty, but consideration. "That depends on you," he said, and the words lingered between them, heavy with possibility, and Sophie looked down at her baby, who was now peacefully asleep, unaware of the shift happening around him, and she realized something that both comforted and unsettled her at the same time. This was no longer just about getting through the day or finding a place to sleep tonight. This was something bigger, something that could change the direction of her life completely. And as the car moved deeper into the city, past buildings that grew taller and streets that felt more distant from anything she had known, Sophie tightened her hold just slightly, her heart caught between fear and hope, because for the first time in a long time, she was no longer certain what tomorrow would look like. And that uncertainty felt different now, not like something to survive, but something that might finally lead somewhere she had never imagined. The car slowed as it turned onto a quiet street lined with tall glass buildings that reflected the city lights like mirrors, and Sophie felt her chest tighten again as the vehicle finally came to a smooth stop in front of a towering hotel entrance, the kind she had only ever seen in pictures or passed by without thinking she would ever step inside. And before she could even gather her thoughts, the driver was already opening her door, his movements precise and respectful, and Sophie hesitated. For a brief second, her instincts still pulling her back, reminding her that this was not her world, that she did not belong in places like this. But then she looked down at her baby, still asleep and peaceful, and she stepped out, holding him carefully as her shoes touched the clean polished ground, and immediately the doors opened, staff inside greeting them with quiet professionalism as if they had been expecting this exact moment. And Sophie felt it again, that shift in how people looked at her, not with judgment this time, but with a kind of attention that made her uneasy because she knew it was not really about her. It was about him, about the man walking just behind her who seemed to move through this environment like it was an extension of himself. And as they entered the lobby, the space opened up around them, high ceilings, soft lighting, the faint sound of piano music somewhere in the background, everything carefully designed to feel effortless and perfect, and Sophie slowed her steps without realizing it, taking in the details, the quiet luxury, the sense of calm that felt so far removed from the life she had been living. And then a woman approached them from behind the front desk, her smile polite but clearly directed toward Alexander. "Everything is ready, Mr. Hayes," she said, her tone respectful, and Sophie felt her grip tighten slightly again because hearing his name here, in this place, made everything more real, more undeniable, and Alexander nodded once, then turned his attention to Sophie. "You will stay here tonight," he said simply, as if it was already decided, and Sophie blinked, her mind racing because this was happening too fast, each step pulling her further into something she had not chosen but could not seem to stop. "I cannot afford this," she said quietly, the words automatic, shaped by years of knowing exactly what she could and could not have. And he looked at her, not impatient, not surprised, just steady. "You are not paying for it," he replied, and that simple answer left no room for argument. But still, something inside her resisted, not because she did not need this, but because accepting it felt like stepping into a life that was not hers, a life she did not understand. And the woman at the desk handed over a key card, her attention shifting briefly to Sophie with a polite nod. "Your suite is prepared," she said, and that word alone made Sophie pause. Suite, not a room, not something small and temporary, but something bigger, something she had never imagined for herself. And she looked at Alexander again, searching for some kind of explanation, something that would make this feel less overwhelming. "Why are you doing all this for me?" she asked. Her voice softer now, more vulnerable than before, and for a moment, he held her gaze, his expression unreadable but not distant. "Because you need a chance," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made her believe he was not just talking about tonight, not just about a place to sleep, but something more, something deeper, and Sophie felt that unfamiliar feeling rise again, a mix of fear and hope, of doubt and possibility, because no one had ever looked at her like she was worth an opportunity, like she was more than the struggles she carried. And as she took the key card into her hand, she realized that this moment, standing in a place she never expected to be, was not just about accepting help. It was about stepping into something unknown, something that could either change everything or leave her more lost than before. And as she turned slightly toward the elevators, her baby stirring gently in her arms, she could not shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far bigger than a single night in a hotel, something that had already started the moment she sat down on that plane. The elevator doors closed softly behind Sophie, sealing her into a quiet space that felt almost too still after everything that had just happened. And she stood there for a moment, holding her baby close, her fingers tightening slightly around the key card as if it might disappear if she did not hold on to it firmly enough. And she glanced at the mirrored walls, catching a glimpse of herself that made her pause. Her hair slightly out of place, her clothes worn from travel, her expression caught, somewhere between disbelief and exhaustion. And for a second, she barely recognized the person looking back at her, not because she had changed, but because everything around her had. And the elevator began to rise smoothly, each floor passing with a soft chime that seemed louder than it should have been, giving her too much time to think, too much time to question whether she had made the right choice stepping into this situation, accepting something she did not fully understand from someone she barely knew. And yet she had not turned back. She had not said no. And that realization settled in her chest as both a quiet fear and a fragile sense of something new. And when the doors finally opened, she stepped out slowly, following the signs down a quiet hallway where the carpet softened her footsteps and the lighting felt warm but distant, and she found the number on the door, hesitating just for a moment before sliding the card and hearing the soft click that confirmed it was real, that this space was now hers, at least for tonight. And when she pushed the door open, she stopped completely, her breath catching as the room revealed itself, not just a room, but something far beyond that, a wide-open suite with large windows stretching across one wall, the city lights glowing outside like a distant skyline she had never been part of, and inside everything was clean, organized, almost untouched, as if it had been waiting for someone else. Someone who belonged here. And Sophie stepped in slowly, her eyes moving across the space, the couch, the neatly made bed, the small details that spoke of comfort and ease, things she had not allowed herself to expect for a very long time. And she gently set her baby down on the bed, adjusting the soft blanket around him as he stirred slightly before settling again. And for the first time since the flight, since the chaos and the noise and the constant pressure, everything became quiet, truly quiet. And Sophie stood there, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the bed, her shoulders lowering as the weight she had been carrying for so long finally had a place to rest, even if just for a moment. And she closed her eyes briefly, taking a slow breath as the reality of the situation began to settle in. This was not temporary in the way she was used to, not a quick solution or a fragile arrangement that could fall apart at any second. This felt stable, intentional, and that made it harder to understand, harder to trust. And she opened her eyes again, looking around the room as if searching for answers that were not there, wondering what came next, what this man expected from her, what this opportunity really meant beyond the comfort of this space. And just as those thoughts began to build, there was a soft knock at the door, gentle but clear, and Sophie's heart skipped slightly as she turned toward it, her instincts returning instantly, cautious, alert, and she moved slowly, checking on her baby once more before walking to the door and opening it just enough to see. And outside stood a hotel staff member holding a small envelope, his expression polite and neutral. "This was left for you, Miss Miller," he said, and Sophie took it carefully, her fingers brushing the smooth paper as a quiet sense of anticipation rose inside her, because she knew, without needing to open it yet, that whatever was inside would not be simple, would not be random. It would be something deliberate, something that would push this moment further into something she could not turn away from. And as she closed the door and looked down at the envelope in her hands, standing alone in a place that did not feel like hers, but was now undeniably part of her story, she realized that the next step was no longer about survival. It was about choice, and that was something she had not been given in a very long time. Sophie stood still for a few seconds, the envelope resting in her hands as if it carried more weight than it should, and she could feel it, that quiet shift in the air again. The same feeling she had on the plane when everything started to change without warning. And slowly she moved toward the table near the window, the city lights stretching out below her like something distant and unreachable, and she placed the envelope down carefully before sitting, her movements slower now, more deliberate, as if she was trying to control the pace of what was happening. And for a moment she just looked at it, her fingers brushing along the edge, her mind running through possibilities she could not fully form, because nothing about this situation followed the rules she was used to. Nothing felt predictable, and that was what made it so difficult to trust. And finally, taking a quiet breath, she opened it, sliding out a single folded note and a card. And her eyes went to the note first. Her hands steady but her heart not, and she unfolded it carefully, reading the simple message written in clean, precise handwriting. This is not charity. This is an opportunity. If you choose to take it, be ready tomorrow at 9 in the morning. Someone will come for you. Do not be late. And beneath it, a name she already knew, Alexander Hayes. And Sophie stared at the words, reading them again as if they might change, as if there was something hidden between the lines she was missing. But the message was clear, direct, and it left no room for misunderstanding. This was not just about helping her for one night. This was something structured, intentional, something that came with expectations even if they were not fully explained. And she lowered the note slowly, her gaze shifting to the card that had been inside the envelope. And when she picked it up, she saw it was a key card, not like the one for her room, but something different, heavier, with a small printed label that simply read access. And her mind immediately began to race, because this was no longer just about staying in a hotel. This was about stepping into something unknown, something that could change her life in ways she could not predict. And for a moment doubt crept in, strong and familiar, reminding her of every time things had seemed promising only to fall apart, every time she had trusted too quickly and paid the price for it. And she leaned back slightly in her chair, her eyes closing for just a second as she tried to steady herself, because this decision felt different, heavier, not just about her, but about her baby, about the future she had been trying to build with nothing but determination and exhaustion. And she opened her eyes again, looking across the room at the bed where her son slept peacefully, unaware of the choice in front of her. And something inside her shifted again, quieter this time but stronger, because she realized that doing nothing, walking away, going back to the life she had been living without even trying, that was also a choice. And maybe that was the one she had been making for too long, not because she wanted to, but because she had never been given another option. And now she had one, unexpected and unclear, but real. And she stood up slowly, the note still in her hand as she walked toward the window, looking out over the city that felt so far removed from everything she knew. And she whispered the words to herself, almost as if testing them. 9 in the morning. And the time sounded simple, but the meaning behind it was anything but. And as she stood there, holding on to something that could either open a door or lead her into something she was not prepared for, Sophie made a quiet decision, not with certainty, not without fear, but with something she had not felt in a long time, the willingness to take a chance. And as the night settled around her and the room grew still again, she knew that whatever happened next would not be something she could undo, and that made the choice both terrifying and impossible to ignore. The next morning came faster than Sophie expected, not because she slept well, but because her mind never fully rested, drifting between doubt and possibility until the soft glow of early sunlight slipped through the curtains and pulled her back into the moment she could no longer avoid. And for a few seconds she lay still, staring at the ceiling as everything from the night before rushed back into place. The flight, the man, the note, the choice, and her heart began to beat faster as she turned her head toward the bedside table where the envelope still rested, exactly where she had left it, a quiet reminder that none of it had been a dream. And she pushed herself up slowly, careful not to wake her baby, and checked the time, 8:23 in the morning, less than 40 minutes until everything would either begin or fall apart. And she sat there for a moment, letting the weight of that settle in, because this was it. There was no more time to question, no more space to hesitate. She had already made her decision the moment she did not throw the note away, and now she had to follow through. And she moved quickly but carefully, getting ready with a sense of focus she had not felt in a long time. Not rushing, not panicking, just moving with purpose, as if something inside her had already shifted into place. And when she was done, she looked at herself one more time in the mirror, still the same person, still carrying the same past, but standing in a moment that felt entirely different. And then there was a knock at the door, exactly at 9, not a second early, not a second late, and Sophie felt her breath catch as she walked toward it, her baby in her arms, her hand steady as she opened it, and outside stood a woman in a tailored suit, her posture straight, her expression professional but not unkind. "Miss Miller," she said with a small nod. "We are ready for you." And Sophie stepped out, closing the door behind her, the quiet click echoing louder than it should have, because it felt like she was closing more than just a hotel room. She was closing the space between her old life and whatever was coming next, and they walked together down the hallway, into the elevator, and back through the lobby. But this time, everything felt different, not unfamiliar, but expected, as if she had already stepped into this world, and now there was no turning back, and outside another car was waiting, not as long as the one from last night, but just as polished, just as precise. And Sophie got in without hesitation this time, her movements more certain even if her thoughts were not. And the ride was quiet, the city passing by in a blur of motion and light as they moved toward a destination she had not been told. And she glanced at the woman beside her, wanting to ask questions, wanting to understand what exactly she had agreed to. But something held her back, a sense that the answers would come soon enough. And when the car finally slowed and pulled into a private entrance of a tall glass building, Sophie felt that same tension rise again. Not fear exactly, but awareness, because this place felt important, not just expensive or impressive, but significant, like decisions were made here that shaped things far beyond its walls. And as she stepped out, looking up at the structure that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky, she felt smaller than she had in a long time, but also strangely present, like she had been brought here for a reason she was about to understand. And the woman led her inside without hesitation, past security, through a quiet lobby where everything moved with purpose, and toward a set of elevators that required the card she had been given. And as the doors opened and she stepped in, her heart began to race again, because she knew, without needing to be told, that whatever waited at the top was not just an opportunity, it was the answer to a question she had not even known she was asking. And as the elevator began its smooth ascent, Sophie held her baby a little closer, her eyes fixed forward, ready or not for whatever came next. The elevator slowed so smoothly that Sophie barely felt it stop. But her heart knew the moment had arrived before the doors even opened, and when they finally slid apart, she was met with a quiet, expansive space that felt nothing like the busy floors below, the air calmer, more controlled, as if every detail had been carefully designed to allow only what mattered to exist there. And she stepped out slowly, her baby resting against her shoulder, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on him, standing near the large windows that overlooked the entire city. Alexander Hayes, exactly where she somehow expected him to be, his posture relaxed yet grounded, as if this place was not just where he worked, but where he belonged. And for a brief moment Sophie hesitated, feeling the distance between them more clearly than ever, not just in space but in everything that had shaped their lives up to this point. And then he turned, as if he had known she was there all along, his expression calm but focused. "You are on time," he said, his voice carrying across the room with quiet certainty. And Sophie nodded slightly, stepping forward, each step steady even if her thoughts were not, because this was the moment she had been moving toward since the plane since the note, since she chose not to walk away. And as she got closer, she realized there was no one else in the room, no assistants, no distractions, just him and whatever this conversation was about to become. And she shifted her baby gently, grounding herself before speaking. "I am here," she said, simple but honest, and something in his expression softened just slightly, not a smile, but recognition, as if that was the only answer he needed, and he gestured toward a chair nearby. "Sit," he said, and Sophie did. Carefully, her posture straight but not tense, her attention fully on him now. And for a moment he did not speak, his gaze steady, as if he was measuring something, not judging, not testing, just understanding. And then he finally moved, walking a few steps closer. "Do you know why I asked you to come here?" he said, and Sophie shook her head, because she could guess, she could imagine, but she did not know, not really, and he nodded once, as if expecting that. "Because I do not invest in situations," he continued, his tone even, deliberate. "I invest in people," and the words settled between them, heavier than they sounded, and Sophie felt her breath catch slightly, because this was no longer about help, no longer about kindness. This was something else entirely, something that carried weight and expectation, and she held his gaze, not backing away even as the meaning began to unfold. "You handled yourself on that flight differently than most would," he said. "You were exhausted, overwhelmed, and still you did not give up control. You did not let the situation define you." And Sophie felt something shift inside her at those words, because no one had ever described her that way before. No one had ever looked at her struggle and seen strength instead of weakness. And before she could respond, he continued, "I have built everything I have from moments like that, from people who choose to stand when it would be easier to fall." And there was something in his voice now, something more personal, something that connected back to what he had said before, about someone helping him when he had nothing. And Sophie realized this was not random. This was intentional in a way she had not fully understood until now. And he stopped in front of her, his presence steady but not overwhelming. "I am offering you an opportunity," he said. "A position, a place to start, something that can grow if you prove that you are capable of more than just surviving." And Sophie felt her heart race, not from fear this time, but from the sudden weight of possibility. Because this was real, this was something she could step into, something that could change everything if she was willing to take it. And she looked down briefly at her baby, then back up at him, her voice quiet but firm. "And if I fail?" she asked, not out of doubt but out of honesty. And he held her gaze without hesitation. "Then you will leave with more than you had before," he said. "But if you do not try, you will never know what you could have become." And the room fell quiet again, the city stretching endlessly behind him, the future just as wide and uncertain in front of her. And Sophie realized that this was the moment, not just a chance, but a turning point. And as she took a slow breath, her decision already forming before the words came, she understood something clearly for the first time. This was not